Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast, our series on the REINS Act in Focus. I'm Andrew Langer. Joining me right now is Dan Goldbeck. He is Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum. And Dan, let's just jump right into it.
Sure.
The REINS Act, I mean, it's a long time coming. In your perspective, in your view, how would the REINS Act change the regulatory landscape?
Sure. So as you allude to, it's been kind of around for a while as a reform idea. And really what it does, it kind of changes the order of operations. Right now, probably the main tool that Congress has to address administrative rulemakings is the Congressional Review Act, which has been around for 30 years. Has only been used sort of sparingly until the past decade or so. And the difference is that under the Congressional Review Act, the agencies put out rules and there's a limited period where they're out there, and then Congress can go in and have a resolution of disapproval to repeal that rule if they don't like it. We saw that under the first Trump administration. We've seen a little bit under the second one. And actually, the Biden administration had, I think, 3 rules under Trump that they repealed using the Congressional Review Act. But it's very kind of piecemeal, and it lets the rules go into effect before Congress has a say in it, really. Whereas the REINS Act, it changes that so that instead of Congress being the second actor, essentially they have to get approval first before the agency can put forward these major rules. And it's important to note that it's only the major rules. Your typical other rulemakings are typically going to get by just fine.
So let's talk about this, because I've talked about it with some of our colleagues here already. And in fact, had a conversation yesterday with Wayne Cruz, and you know what I've always admired, by the way, folks, about Daniel is that his numbers agree with my numbers, because that's the way it works, right? It's
Sure.
we appreciate it. Daniel and I both are in agreement that the cost of the regulatory state right now is somewhere around $4 trillion annually. And as you point out, the vast majority of this is not the so-called major rules, which that definition has shifted over time. But I asked Ryan Young about this from CEI. Have you guys done any quantification of what, if the REINS Act had been in place, what the range of cost savings, regulatory cost savings might have been, if every rule had been overturned by some kind of REINS Act proceeding, from the beginning, to if none of them had been right, we'd still be at a $4 trillion regulatory cost. But where might we be if the REINS Act had been implemented when it was first introduced 11, 12, 13 years ago?
Sure. So I haven't actually quite done that calculation yet. But if you just look at, so we have a site that I maintain, regrodeo.com, where we track basically all the rulemakings that come through. Going back to 2005. We're working on getting even further back, but
nice.
It's taking some time to do that. Hopefully to get the entirety of the first W. Bush administration there.
Sure.
Anyway, so across that now 20 years of rulemakings across various administrations, we have at about $3 trillion total in terms of final rules. And so your sort of estimate of $4 trillion, if you include, everything before that too, I think is a pretty reasonable one at that. And so I don't know if I could put necessarily a number of how much REINS would have repealed. The interesting thing I was looking at before we got on here is, I know one of the criticisms about REINS is how it'll sort of gunk up the works, and you won't be able to pass important rulemakings and such. Going to the Government Accountability Office's database of major rules going back to, I think it goes back to 1996 because it's part of the Congressional Review Act.
Sure.
Structure. They have just over 91,000 rulemakings total listed in that database.
Wow.
And when you toggle on that on the major rule designation, only about 2,300 of those are designated major.
Sure.
By GAO. And so that comes up to about 2.5% of all rulemakings.
Okay.
Now, obviously, as we're sort of talking about here, the major ones, 100 million or more, they're going to have more of an impact than 2.5%. And so that's going to be an interesting aspect of it too. But I think it's just important to note that, it is a limited subset. It comes out to, if you did sort of an average per year over the past 30 years, it would be 78 rules on average per year would be subject to the REINS Act, essentially.
Wow.
And so you think about, it's really putting it back in Congress's hands, and for some that might not be a great idea these days. I don't know. But you think
But
about of all the things they do and don't do, they could probably take 78 more votes per year.
right. Especially on this, and
Yeah.
yet, I guess it gets into the other question, which is, if you are in, if you are a member of Congress and the opposite party is in power, right?
Yes.
So, this again gets at my point of Democrats should be as interested in this as Republicans are, because it puts a check on Republican presidents that they don't like. Talk a little bit about this.
Sure. I mean, that's a point that I think really is underrated in a lot of ways. Because I think over the past decade or so of REINS being around as an idea, obviously it's been focused on, you know, holding back or repealing, particularly the Obama and Biden administration's rules. But I think it's really about returning the power back to Congress to make the determination of major policies. And so I think for this instance, for all, you know, the angst that, folks on the left have about Trump, this could be, if they take Congress next year and then they're in charge of
Right.
Congress, then it could be a roadblock to what he wants to do, and so some in your audience might not appreciate that or not. I don't know.
No,
But it's sort of thing of
no,
it's
the point is, it doesn't matter.
yeah,
It is
yeah,
what it is, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's the
yeah,
that's the point at the end of the day. It's the whole nature of the separation of powers,
yeah.
the dual sovereignty system that we have. The idea is that it's supposed to protect individual rights regardless of who's in power, isn't it?
And another sort of
Yeah.
underrated aspect of this too is in light of the other branch of our government, the
Mm.
judiciary with Supreme Court,
Nobody has
we
talked about
recently
this yet.
had
Yeah.
we have the major questions doctrine now, at least for the foreseeable future, as long as this court sort of maintains its, composition, you have to think, and that will get more developed as years go on, and as cases matriculate up and everything, and they make determinations about what the parameters of that are. But a lot of the major questions doctrine is essentially, if it has a major economic impact, but Congress hasn't spoken to whether they authorize it or not,
Right.
well, we can have that, authorization up front with the REINS Act. And so we can either have this discussion down the line, 5, 10 years when, something comes up to the Supreme Court and they decide on it, or Congress can actually just affirmatively act upon it. And so I think it's an interesting interplay there too that goes under discuss.
Let's talk about this, which is the issue of opportunity cost. I spend a lot of time talking about this issue because, we focus on direct regulatory cost, right? Which is, there's a
Mhm.
mandate that comes down. It says you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to spend time doing this, or paperwork, or you have to buy this kind of equipment. But there's an opportunity cost to regulation, that multiplies it, right? The idea being that if you're measuring the impact, yes, we're spending money, or we're forcing a business to spend money paying an employee to do the paperwork or comply with the regulation, forgetting that that employee's productive time is being taken. We even with this, even with the REINS Act, we tend to understate the overall cost of regulation, don't we, Dan?
Yeah, I think the opportunity cost aspect of it is massive. I
Yeah.
think one of the things that we do is with Reg Rodeo is beyond just tracking the agency estimate of costs that they provide us. Under the Paperwork Reduction Act, they also have to estimate the paperwork that goes into
Right.
all these rules. And sometimes there'll be rules where, their estimated cost is relatively low, but then they'll have like 1 million hours in paperwork.
Right.
And if you just think of, to your point, the opportunity cost of, folks having to fill out that paperwork and comply with all that, it really, I think, goes underappreciated. And also, I think it's important to note too the disparity between small businesses and larger
Right.
ones. Your big, large corporations have floors of lawyers and accountants to deal with all this, whereas your mom and pops, it's sue from accounting if they even have an accounting
Right.
desk at all that has to deal with it, and so it creates a really outsized burden on a lot of small entities compared to the big ones.
It's funny. You and I haven't talked about this before, but I still advocate for this. In the same time we've had, the famous, I won't raise taxes pledge. I've talked about a no net loss of private lands pledge in the past, in terms of the federal acquisition of land. But I've also talked about this idea of a no net loss of time pledge, right? That for agencies, for every 15 minutes of added paperwork burden, we mandate that they have to take off burden because time is the only resource that is truly
Mhm.
finite. You can't make more of it. Your thoughts here? I mean, obviously there would be incentives to massively underestimate, if they don't already, the amount of time paperwork burden that folks have. But at least getting some kind of an accounting of this, an aggregated time for an average regulated entity. What are your thoughts here, Dan?
Well, it's sort of interesting because we've actually been, myself and my predecessors have been here at AF, have been talking about that for a little bit of,
Wow.
similar to, what we have with this regulatory budget is how about we just do a paperwork budget?
Right.
And we actually already kind of have a basic framework. OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, tracks on some level. Obviously, there are, as you point to, concerns about how agencies are estimating these, but it goes back pretty long way. And so right now, it's I think around 11.6 billion hours
Wow.
of paperwork across all the agencies. And it's hovered, anywhere between 10 to I think it hit its high point of about 12 point something last year. So it's sort of thing of, and this is all recorded and measured under the Paperwork Reduction Act,
Right.
which has been around for decades now, and I haven't seen any meaningful reduction uh,
No.
in my experience of it. There, it fluctuates, every few years and everything. A lot of that's tax paperwork changes and all that, but yeah, I think it's essentially, taking the same sort of framework that we're seeing with the regulatory budget, but just limiting it to just the paperwork side of, all right, we have this number here. Let's aim to do a 10% cut over the next year or
Right.
so somehow. And I think that it's a more interesting idea too, getting back to sort of the politics of it, because I think a lot of debates about, the regulatory budget is, the concerns about taking away agency authority to regulate certain things that perhaps maybe need to be, or, people can have debates about that. But a lot of the paperwork is, looking at aspects of it that are redundant. Like, are you filing the same form for five different agencies? Like,
Right.
and there are sort of tools that they've tried to use in limited ways to try to consolidate that, streamline all of that. But I think you need to have a more concerted effort to really make a real dent in it.
Yeah, it's literally just had this conversation with somebody at the SBA about the idea of a business compliance one stop. It's 2025, right? There's no reason why we can't use the technological tools that are out there
Yeah.
to solve this problem. And certainly, right? If let's assume for a moment, you and I both know that uh, all this regulation, is
Yeah.
is not all equal and all, appropriate. But let's
Yeah.
assume for a moment that it all was. Let's assume that every regulation serves an important purpose that's out there, making it as easy as possible for folks to comply. This is definitely a good thing. Before I let you go, I mean, on this issue of the REINS Act, what happens if it doesn't pass this time around? What does it mean down the road if we don't get a handle on this?
So I think as we sort of talked about earlier, we're already in a situation where I think based upon this major questions doctrine of the Supreme Court, we're going to kind of have a version of it regardless. It's just
Right.
going to take a little bit more time. It's going to involve, a lot of lawyers getting paid handsomely for it.
Right.
And it's going to touch, it'll set precedent that might affect agency action going forward, depending upon how different cases come down. But it's going to be a lot more drawn out process, and it's going to have a lot more uncertainty, which I think is, as we're seeing across different policy areas in recent years, the uncertainty is just what kills you as a business and as an
100%.
enterprise. And so you aren't allowed to do, long-term planning. And so I think it's the sort of thing where, regardless of whether someone agrees or disagrees with REINS, we're kind of already getting a version of it
Right.
on a slow roll. with a lot of uncertainty mixed in. And so I think that that's a concern.
And uncertainty breeds expense. I mean, that's absolutely true. Though I hate to say it, we whisper it. We as much as we'd like to find ways to defund the lawyers, we don't want to arouse their suspicions and get them more
Sure.
involved. Dan, how do
Yeah.
folks find out more about the good work that you're doing for the American Action Forum?
So yeah, so we're just at AmericanActionForum.org. We're a center right think tank that focuses on free market pro-growth policies. Our president's Doug Holzaken, former CBO director, advisor for McCain's '08 campaign. And yeah, you can check out our website there, and then also the site I sort of maintain, regradio.com, that tracks, basically updates weekly with everything that comes through the Federal Register. I log whatever the agency has for their estimates and then try to compile it all into one picture and use it to track trends and such.
I am unabashed about this. Dan's doing great work because his numbers agree with mine. No, he does great work in any
Good.
case. Dan Goldbeck, thank you so very much for
Oh,
joining us today.
yes, thanks for having me.
It's Dan Goldbeck. He is the Director of Regulatory Policy for the American Action Forum. This has been yet another piece in our ongoing series about the REINS Act in focus. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.